4,000 years ago, there were 4 cradles of civilization in the world: Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and China, and they all developed along rivers. Why rivers? Because rivers provide water, silt, and transportation. The 2 cradles we're going to talk about today are Mesopotamia and Egypt. Let's start with Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia was located between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. It was home to several different groups of people, including the Sumerians, the Babylonians, and the Assyrians. Now, the Sumerians were the first to settle in the region around 3200 BC. They built city-states like Ur and Ur, and they were responsible for many inventions, including the plow, the wheel, and the sailboat. The Sumerians also developed the world's first known system of writing, called cuneiform. This is a writing system where symbols are made by pressing a wedge-shaped tool into a soft clay tablet. Next came the Achaeans, who were the first to unite much of Mesopotamia into an empire around 2300 BC. The empire didn't last long, though. After the Akkadians were the Babylonians, who were famous for their law code, called the Code of Hum. The code was written on a black stone stele, and it established a system of punishments that were meant to be swift and severe. It also established a set of rules for things like business contracts and marriage. Then there were the Assyrians, who were known for their military strength. They built an empire around 1800 BC that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. They also developed the world's first iron weapons, and they used them to conquer much of the Middle East. But why did this civilization collapse? Well, one reason was that the rivers weren't always so nice. Floods and droughts were common, which led to famine and disease. Another reason was that Mesopotamia was situated between 2 warring empires, the Hittites and the Egyptians, and they often got caught in the middle. But perhaps the biggest reason was you see, over time, the rivers had deposited a thick layer of salt in the soil. And when the civilizations tried to grow crops, the salt would poison the plant. So eventually the land became too salty to farm, and the civilizations had to move away. Meanwhile, to the north, along the Nile River in Egypt, a similar story was just beginning. By 3100 BC, the Egyptians had settled along the Nile, and they built a kingdom that would last for over 3,000 years. Like the Mesopotamians, the Egyptians were also very dependent on the river. The Nile flooded every year, which deposited a fresh layer of silt that was perfect for farming. This silt also made the land extremely fertile, so they could grow lots of crops with very little effort. Egyptian society was divided into 3 classes: the pharaohs, the nobles, and the peasants. The pharaohs were considered divine rulers, and they were in charge of maintaining order in the kingdom. The nobles were the ones who actually ran the government, while the pharaohs were more concerned with religion. The peasants were the ones who did most of the work, but they were still very happy to live in Egypt. Unlike Mesopotamia, Egypt was largely free from invaders, and that's because the natural barriers that protected Egypt were unlike anything seen in Mesopotamia. To the west was the Libyan desert, to the east was the Red Sea, and to the south was the Nubian desert. The only way to really get into Egypt was through the Mediterranean Sea. And to help protect the kingdom, the Egyptians built huge walls around their city. Because of all these advantages, Egypt became one of the wealthiest kingdoms in the ancient world. They controlled the trade routes between Europe, Asia, and Africa, and they became especially famous for their art and their architecture. Most famously, they built huge pyramids to serve as tombs for their pharaohs. But as the Egyptian kingdom grew wealthier, it also became more unequal. The gap between the rich and the poor grew wider and wider, and eventually the poor started revolting against the pharaohs. In 332 BC, Egypt was conquered by Alexander the Great, and after he died, it was ruled by his general Ptolemy. Although the Egyptian kingdom was over, The cultural achievements of Egypt would influence the entire Mediterranean world for centuries to come. Thanks for watching!